He found a name carved into a tree by the river. Just a name. June, plus Thomas, 1974. His father's name was Thomas. But who was June? His father never told him, never mentioned her once in his entire life. So Elias started searching. He asked the old-timers in town. He dug through county records. He held old photographs in his hands and tried to read the face of a woman who had vanished before he was born. And the whole time he was searching, the answer was sitting across from him at the dinner table every single night. He just didn't know it yet. Stay with me. Because this story isn't just about a name on a tree. It's about everything two families lost, and everything one piece of land quietly kept safe for 50 years, waiting for the right people to finally come home to it. This channel is where the wide open West comes alive. Cowboys and quiet courage, love that weathers hard seasons, the bond between a mother and her child, and the simple human truth that people are worth more than the land they stand on. If those stories speak to you, you are in exactly the right place. Here is what this story gives you, if you let it. It gives you permission to believe that the things your parents loved and lost did not disappear. They were held somewhere. In the ground, in the memory of a river, in the bark of an old tree. And sometimes, without anyone planning it, the thread finds its way back. That is the story of Elias and June. That is the story of what the land remembered when the people had forgotten. If this kind of storytelling finds something in you, do something small for me. Leave a like before you go. Drop one word in the comments. Just one word for how this story made you feel. Share it with someone who needs a quiet reminder that good things do find their way back. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment. New stories come every week, and every single one of them is worth your time.
The first thing Elias Croft did every morning was count his cattle, not because he enjoyed it, not anymore. He counted them because the number had been going down for 3 years running, and a man who stops paying attention to a thing that is shrinking tends to wake up one day and find it gone entirely. It was 5 in the morning. The temperature was 34 degrees. He walked the east pasture with his breath coming out in small white clouds, and he counted 11. 11 head of cattle on 180 acres of Larimer County, Colorado. 3 years ago, he had run 23. The difference between those two numbers was a brother who had vanished and a bank that had not. He did not dwell on it. Dwelling was a luxury for men who had the time. After the count, he went to work on the northeast fence line. The posts had been rotting since summer, and he had been putting off the repair the way you put off things that cost money you do not have. He was using the wrong nails. He knew they were the wrong nails. The right ones cost $18 a box, and he had not been able to make that number feel reasonable for the last 6 weeks. His hands were bare. His work gloves had worn through in August. He had not replaced them. At the third post, he stopped. He had stopped at this post many times before, not because of the post itself, but because of what someone had carved into the wood years ago. The letters were faded and splitting with the grain. E. C. 2001. The year he had taken over this ranch from his father. He had been 24 years old. He had believed, with the certainty that belongs only to young men and fools, that land was the most dependable thing a person could build a life around. He touched the letters for one moment, then kept driving nails. The morning would have been like every other morning that November, except it was not. He walked out to the river bend after finishing the fence. The Cache la Poudre ran along the western edge of his remaining acreage, and after a hard rain the week before, he needed to check the bank for erosion. If the bank gave way, he lost more of the assessed value. If the assessed value dropped further, the number he owed the bank became even harder to look at. The old cottonwood stood at the bend where the water went quiet before moving on. A wide tree, older than anyone living on this land. He had walked past it for 25 years without stopping. That morning he stopped. He was pulling back a length of vine to check the base diameter, and his hand found the carving before his eyes did. His fingers traced the letters in the rough bark. He stepped back to look. June plus Thomas, 1974. He stood very still. Thomas was his father's name. There was no other Thomas Croft who had ever worked this ground. His father had been born on this land and buried on it, and in between those two events he had walked this river bend more times than any living person could count. But June. Elias did not know that name. His mother had been Margaret, dead since 1989. His father had lived alone for the 17 years after that, quiet and self-contained. A man who kept his private thoughts the way good ranchers keep their water, stored carefully and not wasted. Who was June? The question was small. It had the feel of something that would stay small. But it followed him home that afternoon the way a sound follows you out of a dark room, present even after you have left the source behind. He took a photograph with his phone. He was not sure why. He just did. That afternoon, he drove into Dot McCready's general store and tacked a help wanted notice to the board by the door. $12 an hour, 6 days a week. Hard physical labor, no exceptions. He had been putting off hiring help for months because his name in Larimer County no longer meant what it used to mean. It used to mean reliable. It used to mean a man who paid his debts on time and kept his word and did not put his neighbors in a difficult position. Now it meant something else. It meant the man whose brother had borrowed against the family land and disappeared. It meant risk. Dot read the notice without commenting. Then she handed him a box of oatmeal cookies she said had not sold. He knew she was lying. He took them anyway because refusing would have hurt her. He stopped at the post office on the way back. He asked Helen at the counter, a woman who had worked there for 40 years, and remembered things the county records did not bother to keep, whether she recalled anyone named June from the valley in the 1970s. Helen considered it. Then she shook her head. June was a real common name back then, she said. Half the girls born in this county between 1950 and 1965 got named June. You'll have to do better than that. Do better. He drove home. He sat with the bank paperwork on one side of the kitchen table and the photograph of the carving on the other side. Two completely unrelated things. That night he looked at the photograph longer than he looked at the numbers. 3 days after posting the notice, someone called. A woman's voice, steady and unhurried. She asked two things. What exactly did the work involve? And did he need someone who knew what they were doing, or just someone who would do what they were told? Elias said, both. She came the next morning. He walked out to the gate and watched her step down from a dark green truck, faded jeans, an old flannel shirt the color of pine bark, boots that had been worn in a specific and unmistakable way, not the way a person wears boots on a first visit to a working ranch, but the way a person wears them after years on ground that is uneven and unforgiving. He noticed the boots first. Boots did not lie about where a person had been. She looked over his written list of work without saying much. Her name was June Calloway. He heard it, and something in him went quiet for a beat. The way a familiar melody will stop you mid-step even when you cannot place where you first heard it. He did not say so. He did not have time to think about it. Then she said, I'll take $9 an hour. He waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest of the sentence. He hired her. Not because it was a sound decision. Because he was out of options and she was standing in front of him in the right kind of boots, and she had asked the right kind of question, and $9 an hour was less than anyone else would have accepted. The question he carried with him as he showed her the barn was simple and had no answer yet. She knew the value of this work. Anyone who asked whether he needed competence or compliance had done this kind of work before. So why would she take less than it was worth? He did not have an answer. He filed the question away and went back to work. What he did not see as she turned to walk toward the barn was the small pause she made. One breath. She looked past him toward the river, toward the cottonwood at the bend, the way a person looks when they are returning to a place they have carried in their mind for a long time. Not curiosity, recognition. He had already turned away. He missed it completely. Her name was June. She was standing on this land, and the carving on that tree read June plus Thomas, 1974. He did not connect those things. Not yet. There was no contract between them, no schedule posted on the wall, no list of duties agreed upon out loud, no conversation about what was expected or what was not. Elias had never worked that way, and he did not start now. People either understood the rhythm of a working ranch or they did not. And the ones who understood it did not need a document to tell them what time to get up. June Calloway understood it. That much was clear from the first morning. He had set up the back room for her the night before she arrived. It had been a storage room since his father died, full of old seed catalogs and broken tools and 3 boxes he had never opened. He cleared out a path to the wall, brought in a mattress from the spare bedroom, left a work lamp on the floor. He did not comment on the accommodations. She did not comment on them either. On the first morning, she woke before he did. He came into the barn at 5:30 to start the feeding and found a handwritten note on the gate of the first stall. She had checked all 11 cattle before dawn. Number 3 showed early signs of joint inflammation in the right front leg. Worth watching. He read the note twice. Then he checked number 3 himself. She was right. He had known about the stiffness in that animal for 2 months. He had noticed it and then gotten busy, and noticed something else and then gone back to worrying about money, the way every thought eventually returned to money that year. He had not written it down. She had been here less than 24 hours, and she had already written it down. He fed the cattle and did not mention it. That week moved the way the first week of any new arrangement moves, both people still learning the edges of the other's habits. Elias ran the ranch by patterns he had built over 25 years, and every one of those patterns was the product of a man working alone. He had his way of doing things. His way of doing things had served him well enough. June had her own ways. She did not announce them. She just did them. The first collision came on Tuesday over the feed portions. Elias had always split the hay evenly among all the cattle, equal shares for every animal, regardless of age or condition. It was simple. It required no judgment calls in the early dark. He came back from getting water to find June redistributing the portions without asking permission. The older animals were getting more. The one carrying a calf was getting more. He watched her work for a moment, did not say anything. The cattle ate every bit of it that morning completely for the first time in weeks. He said nothing. The second collision came on Thursday, over the water pump. It had been running slow for days, and he had been fighting it with the wrong size wrench because the right one was somewhere in the back of the tool chest under everything else, and it was easier to force the wrong one than to dig for the right one. June walked up, reached into her own toolbox, which sat beside the barn door, and was organized in a way his had not been organized since the early 2000s, and handed him the correct wrench without a word. He took it. Did not say thank you. She did not wait for it. That was the second week. By the third week, the daily rhythms had started to settle into something less like 2 people bumping into each other and more like 2 people learning to move around each other in a small space. Not warmth, not yet. Just competence, beginning to recognize competence. The fence work on the west line was the first day they spent entirely side by side. It rained the night before, and the ground smelled like iron and wet clay. They drove posts from opposite ends of the line and worked toward the middle. Elias noticed, without meaning to, the efficiency of her technique. She held the post with her left hand and drove the mallet with her right in the same motion, no second person required. He had been doing this job alone for years and had never worked out that particular method. He started doing it her way without asking. They worked for 3 hours without speaking. Then he asked her, simply because the question had been sitting in his mouth for 2 weeks, whether she had worked a ranch before. June said, "Not exactly." It was the strangest answer he could have gotten. Not exactly. It was not yes, and it was not no, and it contained no further information. He did not push. The day they hauled timber from the north woodlot, the logs were twice as heavy as expected from a week of rain. June had anticipated this. Before they started, she had already rigged the pull rope differently, looped it at a lower angle to distribute the weight. He noticed the rigging before he touched the log and understood immediately why she had done it. A person who has never worked this kind of land figures out the rope after they try and fail. She had figured it out before. He thought about that on the drive back. He was still thinking about it when he asked her again, a different version of the same question. "Where'd you learn to rig a pull like that?" She said, "I watched someone do it a long time ago." He nodded like that answered the question. It did not answer the question. The day they repaired the barn roof was the day he first looked at her directly. They were working from opposite ends of the peak, patching a section where the winter before last had pushed through the old boards. The wind came through the gaps with a sound like slow breathing. He got stuck at a section he could not reach without a longer ladder. June, without discussion, climbed up and leaned out and passed him the materials. They were 2 feet apart. He looked at her face, not because he meant to, because she was right there and he was not moving, and there was nothing else to look at. She was watching her own hands, focused entirely on keeping her grip. The light was gray and thin. She had a way of concentrating that took up all the space in her expression, left no room for anything else. He looked for a second and a half, maybe 2 seconds. Then he took the boards from her hand and turned back to the roof. That night she made dinner. Not because she had been asked, not because it was part of any agreement, because when she looked in the refrigerator, there were 4 things in it, and 3 of them needed to be combined with something else to become a meal, and she combined them. He came in from the barn and sat down and ate. It was the first time in 2 years someone had sat across from him at that table. He did not name that for himself while it was happening. He only noticed afterward that the quiet in the kitchen after the meal was a different quality of quiet than the kind he usually lived in. That was the 3rd week. He went back to the old cottonwood twice more alone, in the evenings. He looked at the carving both times. June plus Thomas, 1974. He had a woman named June sleeping in his back room. And he had a woman named June carved into a tree his father had loved, and he had not put those 2 things next to each other in any deliberate way yet. He was keeping them in separate drawers. The reader could see the whole picture. Elias could not. November settled in and got serious about it. The mornings dropped to 22 degrees, and the water troughs were skinning over with ice before 6 o'clock. Elias and June had developed a routine by then, wordless and efficient, the way routines develop between 2 people who are both too busy to waste time negotiating. She handled the cattle in the mornings. He handled the equipment. They met somewhere in the middle every afternoon and did whatever needed doing together. He had started asking questions in town, not about June Calloway. He was not ready to ask about her directly. He was asking about June Bellamy, the name on the back of the photograph he had found in his father's old box, the name written in his father's handwriting on that single folded slip of paper, J.B. He asked Ray Farley at the hardware store first because Ray was 68 and had lived in Larimer County his whole life, and remembered things the county records did not bother to keep. Ray thought about it, pushing his cap back on his head and looking at the ceiling the way he always did when he was sorting through memory. He said he had a dim recollection of a girl from somewhere east who used to come through the valley in summers when Elias was still small. Pretty, quiet, but the name was gone. He asked Helen at the post office again, this time with the photograph. Helen studied the woman's face for a long moment. Then she said the name Bellamy rang a bell distantly, the way the name of someone you met once at a party rings a bell 20 years later. She thought the Bellamy family might have owned property out toward the county road at some point. She was not certain. He found the certain answer on Carl Preston's porch. Carl Preston was 81 years old and had worked the same piece of ground for 55 of those years without leaving the county for more than 2 weeks at a stretch. He sat on his porch every morning with a cup of coffee, regardless of the temperature, and he had a memory for land history the way other men had a memory for baseball statistics. Elias drove out on a Wednesday. He showed Carl the photograph and said the name Bellamy. Carl looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he said, "June Bellamy, that's Frank Bellamy's girl." Frank and his wife had that piece of ground south of the county road back toward the river. Good land. They sold out and left. Must have been the mid-70s, I think. Had some financial trouble like most people did back then. Sold the land and moved the family east. Elias asked whether he knew what happened to June Bellamy after the family left. Carl said he did not. Lost track, he said. People sell and move on and you lose track. That was all Elias got. But it was enough to build on. He drove back through town and stopped at the county recorder's office. He asked for whatever records existed for the Bellamy property along the South County Road from the 1960s and 1970s. The clerk, a young woman who seemed slightly puzzled by someone wanting paper records from 50 years ago, brought him a thin folder after 20 minutes of searching. He sat at a table in the empty waiting area and went through it. The Bellamy family had owned 220 acres adjacent to the south boundary of the Croft property. Frank Bellamy, the deed holder. The parcel ran down to the river. The sale was recorded in October of 1962. The buyer was Thomas Croft Sr. That was Elias's grandfather. He read that date again. 1962. His father had been about 12 years old in 1962. So June Bellamy's family had sold their land to Elias's grandfather when June was a small child, maybe not even born yet. And then, somehow, 12 years later, in the summer of 1974, a 24-year-old Thomas Croft and a young woman named June Bellamy had stood together at the bend in the river and carved their names into a cottonwood tree. Elias sat with that for a while. The county recorder's office was very quiet. The fluorescent light above him buzzed at a frequency that was just noticeable enough to be annoying. His father had loved a woman whose family had once owned part of this same land. His father had never said a single word about any of this, not once in all the years before his death. He drove home. Warren Hollis was waiting in the driveway when he pulled in. Warren was in his mid-50s and wore the expression of a man doing a job he had made his peace with. He drove a late-model truck that was too clean for ranch country. He shook Elias's hand without warmth and without hostility the way a professional maintains neutral. He had a revised payment schedule. The bank was offering a 30-day extension on the notice given the time of year and the circumstances. This was described as a courtesy, not an obligation on the bank's part. Elias took the paperwork. He said he understood. Warren said, "I hope you can work something out, Elias. I genuinely do." Elias believed he meant it on some level. Warren's father had lost land in a boundary dispute with the Croft family in 1993. Warren had grown up hearing that story. That history did not make him malicious. It just made him disinclined to stretch the rules for someone who carried that last name. That was human. Elias could not bring himself to resent it. When Warren's truck left, Elias noticed June standing in the barn doorway. She had been watching the whole conversation. She had the expression of someone watching a thing unfold exactly the way she had expected it to unfold. He did not ask her about that look. He should have. He did not. That night after dinner, Elias went back to the storage boxes his father had left. He had been going through them slowly, a box at a time, looking for anything that connected to the name on the cottonwood. He was not sure what he was looking for. A letter, maybe. A photograph he had not found yet. Some record that would tell him who June Bellamy had been to his father, not just as a name carved into wood, but as a person. He found another photograph. It was smaller than the first, tucked inside the cover of an old pocket-sized journal. Two people again, but this time closer together. His father, 20-something, in a work shirt, and his hat pushed back on his head. And the woman beside him, looking directly at the camera, her expression open and unhurried, a woman who did not perform for photographs. He looked at her face for a long time. Then he set the photograph down and sat completely still for close to a minute. He picked it up again and looked again. She did not look exactly like June Calloway. The generations showed, but the line of the jaw, the way the shoulders carried themselves, the quality of attention in the eyes, full and present and not particularly concerned with how it appeared to the person watching. He turned the photograph over. Thomas and June Bellamy, Cache La Poudre, September 1974. He sat at that kitchen table with the photograph in his hand and the light from the hallway coming in under June Calloway's door, and he did the arithmetic slowly and carefully. June Bellamy was the woman his father had loved. June Bellamy had been young, perhaps 19 or 20, in 1974. If she had lived a normal life, she would be in her late 60s now. She might have married. She would have taken a different last name. She might have had children. He put the photograph face down on the table. He looked at the light under that door. He did not knock. He was not ready to knock. In the morning, he asked her, as casually as he could make it sound, what her last name was. She said Calloway. He nodded and walked out to the barn. Because Calloway was not Bellamy, he told himself the thought was just a thought. But he kept the photographs in his shirt pocket for the rest of the week. Both of them. He kept reaching up to touch the outline of them through the fabric, the way a man touches a wound to check whether it has stopped hurting yet. He started watching more carefully. He had been watching her all along, the way you watch anyone new in your space, assessing whether they know what they are doing and whether you can trust them with the things that matter. That was the first kind of watching, practical and impersonal. This was a different kind. He was looking for evidence, not consciously, not with a list or a plan. He was simply paying closer attention to the specific things she knew and the specific ways she knew them, and filing those things away in a part of his mind where he put things he had not yet made sense of. The well behind the south barn was the first piece. He sent her to check the pump pressure on a Thursday morning. She was back in 10 minutes. She said the well had started to silt up, the way it did every October when the clay expanded, and would clear on its own by mid-November. He should not try to force it. He stood there looking at her. That well had a 25-year history of silting in early October and running clear again before Thanksgiving. He had learned that from his father. His father had learned it from watching. It was the kind of knowledge that came from years of seasonal observation on this specific piece of ground. It was not the kind of knowledge a person who arrived 3 weeks ago should have. He said, "How do you know it clears in November?" She said, "It just makes sense given the soil type." It was a reasonable answer. It did not satisfy him. The second piece was the name for the river bend. He was explaining something about the western boundary to her, trying to describe where the fence line turned, and he used the phrase, "the still water," to indicate the bend where the cottonwood stood. It was an old local phrase, not on any map, something his father had used and his grandfather before that. Something passed down in conversation. She nodded without any pause, as if the phrase was familiar. He stopped mid-sentence. "You know that name?" he said. She said, "The still water? It fits. The current slows down there." Which was true. Which was also not an answer. The third piece was the north woodlot. The first time he had sent her to get timber from the north woodlot, she had walked straight to it without asking for directions. He had meant to tell her how to find it after breakfast and had gotten distracted by the pump problem, and when he looked up, she was already gone and back an hour later with the timber loaded. He had not thought much about it at the time. He thought about it now. A person who had never been on this land going to a woodlot that was not visible from the house and was not on any posted map and walking straight to it on the first attempt. He was quiet at dinner that night, and the night after that. She noticed. He could see her noticing, could see the slight adjustment in how she moved around the kitchen, a little more careful, a little more contained. She did not ask what was wrong. She kept doing her work with the same steady competence she brought to everything. That almost made it worse. He drove into town on a Friday to pick up a part for the tractor. While he was at the counter at the hardware store, waiting for Ray to find the right fitting, he noticed a sheet of paper someone had left on the counter. It had been printed and forgotten. He was not trying to read it. The sender's name was at the top of the page. June Calloway, Principal Architect, Calloway Land Design, LLC, Denver, Colorado. The subject line was a payment confirmation. The amount was $83,000. He stood at that hardware store counter and read those 2 lines 3 times. Then he set the paper down and went outside and sat in his truck. $83,000 in a single payment for completed work. She was a professional architect. She ran a company. She had work that paid $83,000 in a transaction. And she was sleeping in his repurposed storage room and working his ranch for $9 an hour. She did not need the money. She had never needed the money. She was here for a reason she had not told him. He drove home. He sat across from her at dinner and ate his food and said less than usual, which was already not much. She did not push. She never pushed. She simply occupied the same space with the same steadiness she always did. And that steadiness now felt like something he was standing at the edge of and could not see the bottom of. After dinner, she went to her room. He stayed at the table with the bank paperwork and the 2 photographs, and the folded slip of paper that read J.B. He laid them all out in front of him for the first time. His father had loved a woman named June Bellamy. The Bellamy family had once owned land adjacent to his. June Bellamy had a daughter somewhere in the world, possibly if she had lived, if she had married and had children. And a woman named June Calloway had appeared at his gate asking for a job she did not need the money for. And she knew things about this land that a stranger should not know. And she looked at the river bend the way a person looks at something they have been carrying in their memory for a long time. He could see the shape of it. He could see the outline. He was not ready to say it aloud. What he said, alone at that table, was this: "She's been here before." Not before she arrived. Before. In some other way. Through someone else's eyes and words and memories. She had been here before. He went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours staring at the ceiling. The dramatic irony of it, which he could not feel, but which the reader could feel all the way through, was this. He had been searching for June Bellamy since the morning he found the carving on the cottonwood. He had been driving to town and pulling records and asking old men on their porches. He had been carrying photographs in his shirt pocket like evidence. The answer had been sitting across from him at dinner every night for a month. He just had not asked the right question yet. December arrived the way December always arrived in Larimer County, which was to say without any particular announcement and with complete commitment. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees overnight, ice on the water troughs by 5 in the morning, the kind of cold that gets into the barn walls and stays there until March. The months of October and November had deposited something between Elias and June that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them had named. It had accumulated the way sediment accumulates, one small thing at a time, imperceptible in any individual moment, but unmistakable when you looked at the whole of it. He made coffee for 2 every morning now, not as a gesture, not as a decision. He simply made enough for 2 the way he used to make enough for 1, the adjustment having happened somewhere outside his awareness. She saved the last of the bread for him on mornings when he came in late from the early chores. She did not say anything about it. It was just there on the counter. He fixed the light in her room one afternoon. It had been flickering since October. He had a replacement bulb in the shop. He put it in while she was out checking the cattle without mentioning it. She left a folded blanket on the barn door hook on the worst mornings. He used it without comment. These things happened between them the way weather happens. Nobody decided them. They just arrived and became part of the daily pattern, woven in so quietly that by the time either of them might have noticed, they were already ordinary. He was still watching for evidence, still carrying the photographs. But the watching had changed quality. It was less investigative now. It was something else. Something he did not have a comfortable name for. The crisis came on a Friday afternoon, and it had nothing to do with June Calloway. His attorney called at 3 in the afternoon. His brother had been located in Albuquerque, New Mexico, alive and apparently in reasonable health. No interest in returning to Colorado. No assets that would meaningfully address the debt. The attorney used the phrase, "no meaningful recovery pathway," and then apologized for the phrasing, which had come out more clinical than intended. Elias said he understood. He thanked the attorney. He ended the call. He was standing in the barn. He stayed standing for a while. His brother's name was David, and they had grown up in this house and built forts in this barn when they were small, and once, when David was 7 and Elias was 12, David had fallen off the top railing of the south fence and broken his arm, and Elias had carried him half a mile back to the house because the truck was out in the field. He sat down on the barn floor, his back against the wall. The hay bale he had been about to move was still sitting in front of him. He looked at it without seeing it. He did not cry. He could not remember the last time he had cried. He was not sure that mechanism still worked in him. But he could not make himself get up. June came in at 4 to bring the horses in for the night. She saw him. She did not ask what happened. She did not say anything at all. She walked across the barn and sat down against the opposite wall, maybe 4 feet away. She folded her arms loosely and leaned her head back against the boards, and just stayed there. The horses were calm. The light outside the barn door was going gray and thin. Wind moved through somewhere in the upper boards with a sound like something breathing. 20 minutes passed, maybe 25. Then Elias stood up. June stood up at the same moment, as if they had agreed to it, which they had not. They brought the horses in and fed them. Then they went inside, and she made dinner, and they ate in silence. But it was not the silence from October, the careful silence of two people who did not know each other yet. It was a different kind. The kind that can only exist between people who have already been through something together, even if neither of them has named what that thing was. That night, Elias sat at the kitchen table alone after she went to bed. He took out the photographs. He looked at the woman named June Bellamy standing beside his young father at the river bend. Then he looked at the light under June Calloway's door. He sat with everything he had gathered. The county records, the old man on the porch, the photograph, the name on the folded paper, the things she knew about this land, the way she looked at the still water the first day she arrived. He could feel the shape of the answer pressing against the inside of his chest like something that wanted out. He did not knock on her door. He told himself it was because he was not certain. He told himself that an accusation without certainty was unfair. He told himself there was time. He was making the wrong decision for reasons that felt, from the inside, like the right ones. He would do this again, once more later, when it cost him more. For now, he put the photographs away and went to bed. The foreclosure notice came on a Monday. It arrived in a standard white envelope with the county seal and the bank's return address in the upper left corner. Elias knew what it was before he opened it. He had been expecting it the way you expect a storm you can see building on the western horizon for 3 days running. He set it on the kitchen table at 6 in the evening without opening it. Then he went out and fed the cattle and came back in and sat down and opened it. Foreclosure proceedings would begin January 15th. That was 6 weeks away. June was at the kitchen counter with a mug of tea. She had seen the envelope. She had not asked. Elias read the notice. He folded it. He looked at the table. And then, not because he intended to speak, not because he had planned what to say, but because he had been carrying the weight of it for so many months that the container had simply reached capacity, he said it. He said, "I'm going to lose the Riverland." June set down her mug. She said, "I know." He looked up at her. The word took a moment to arrange itself properly in his mind. Then he said, "How long have you known?" And she told him. She did not make it into an apology. She did not frame it as a confession or a defense. She simply told him the truth, plain and in order, the way you finally tell something you have been carrying too long and have understood, somewhere along the way, that you cannot carry much longer. Her mother's name had been June Bellamy. She had grown up in Denver, which was where her mother's family had moved after they sold their land in Larimer County in 1962. Her mother had talked about this valley her whole life, about the river, about the September light on the cottonwood trees, about a summer she spent here when she was 20 years old and met a young man named Thomas. They had loved each other for 1 season. Then her family moved again, east this time for work. And Thomas Croft had stayed the way ranchers stayed, rooted to ground. And the world had moved around him while he remained. They had lost each other the way young people lost each other, before phones fit in a pocket and the whole country fit on a screen. Her mother had never said Thomas's last name, not in any way that was meant to be recovered. She had called him Thomas and described the river and the cottonwood tree and the carving they had made together one afternoon in September, and for 40-something years she had carried that summer the way certain people carry certain summers. She had died the previous January. Her last wish had been for her ashes to be returned to that bend in the river. under that tree. June had come out to Larimer County in February, when the ground was still frozen, and she had not been able to get access to the property. It was posted inactive. She had driven away and thought about it for months. Then she had found the financial records in the county database and seen that the property was in foreclosure proceedings. And she had seen the help wanted listing at Dot McCready's store. And she had called. She had never lied. Not once. She had said nothing about why she was here, but she had not said anything false. Elias sat with this. The reader could see the precise nature of his pain. He was not angry because he had been deceived. He was in pain because the truth was better than anything he had imagined during his coldest and most guarded weeks. And it was arriving now, at this kitchen table, at this particular stage of loss, rather than 2 months ago when there had been time to do something with it. They had both been circling the same space for 8 weeks, and neither one had walked directly to the center of it. He said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I didn't know what you would do. This is your land and your father's memory, and I was a stranger asking to scatter someone's ashes on your ground for a reason that would take a long time to explain. I thought I'd do the work first and ask the question later, and then later kept moving." He looked at her. She was not defensive. She was not performing remorse. She was simply telling him the full shape of a thing that had previously only been visible in pieces. He said, "Your mother and my father." She said, "Yes." He looked at the folded foreclosure notice on the table. He looked at the mug of tea she had set down and not picked back up. He said nothing else. Then June stood up. She did it quietly without any display. But she stood up because she needed to, because what she had been afraid of for 2 months had arrived and was sitting in the space between them, and she did not know what to do with it except put some distance between herself and it. She said, "I need to go." He said, "I know." She went to her room. He heard her moving around. He heard the soft sounds of someone packing a bag with care, not in anger, but with the steady, purposeful movement of someone who has decided. She came out 20 minutes later with her bag over her shoulder and her coat on. Her toolbox was still in the barn. She did not take it. She said goodnight. He said goodnight. She went out. He stood at the door and watched the headlights of her truck come on in the yard and arc across the dark and then diminish down the county road until they were gone. He did not run after her. Not because he did not want to. Because he did not know if he had the right. She was not his employee under any formal agreement. She did not owe him her presence. And he had never said one word to her that carried more weight than a work instruction. She did not know what she would be staying for. Neither did he. He went back to the kitchen table. He laid the foreclosure notice and the 2 photographs and the folded paper with J.B. on the table, all at once, side by side, and looked at them together. His father had loved June Bellamy. June Bellamy had loved his father. They had carved their names into a tree, and the tree had held those names for 50 years. And now June Bellamy's daughter had scattered her mother's ashes in the same river and driven away in the dark. He had been searching for June since October. He had found what he was looking for. He just had not been paying enough attention to recognize it until the moment she drove away. He made a decision that night that he would later understand was the wrong one made for a reason that felt completely right. He decided not to go after her. He told himself it was respect. He told himself a man did not chase someone who had chosen to leave. He told himself a lot of things. 10 days passed. He worked the ranch alone, the way he had always worked it before October. And the difference was noticeable in ways that had nothing to do with efficiency. It was not that he could not manage the work. He could. He had managed it alone for years. The fence got mended, the cattle got fed, the water troughs got broken, ice cleared every morning. The work got done. But the back room was empty, and the second coffee mug sat in the cabinet unwashed. And the barn door did not have a blanket on the hook in the mornings, and the hay portions were back to being distributed equally because he had not wanted to change them after she had changed them. He went back to the cottonwood 3 times in those 10 days. He stood at the base of that tree in the winter cold and looked at the carving and thought about the long chain of things that had led to this particular combination of circumstances. His grandfather buying the Bellamy land in 1962. His father meeting June Bellamy by this river in 1974 and falling in love over one summer. The years passing. June Bellamy marrying someone named Calloway and having a daughter and living in Denver and telling her daughter about a cottonwood tree beside a river in Colorado for 40-odd years until she died. And that daughter coming here. He thought about all of that standing in the cold with his bare hands because he still had not bought the right gloves. Warren Hollis came back on a Tuesday. This time there was no extension to offer, no courtesy delay. The paperwork was ready to file with the county. The 30-day extension had elapsed. Warren was professional and unhurried and completely unmovable, not out of cruelty, but out of the particular settled quality that comes when a man has made peace with the work he does. Elias signed the acknowledgement. He shook Warren's hand. He said nothing beyond what the situation required. When Warren's truck was gone, Elias went inside and sat down at the kitchen table. He thought for a long time. Then he got out a piece of paper and a pen. He was not a man who wrote things down much. Ranch records, yes. Inventory, yes. But personal correspondence was not something he had practiced since he was in school and had no choice. He was not sure he was going to do this right. He decided to do it anyway. He wrote the letter to June Calloway at the address he had found on the company website. He kept it short because short was what he was capable of, and because what he had to say did not require length. He wrote, "The Riverland is being foreclosed on January 15th. If you want to bring your mother's ashes before that date, the gate will be unlocked. I'll stay at the north end of the property. You don't owe me any kind of conversation." He put it in an envelope and drove it to the post office that afternoon. On the drive back, he thought about what he had done and what it meant. He had not declared anything. He had not asked for anything. He had not said, "Come back," or "I was wrong," or "I should have called." He had simply held the door open. The property still had a few weeks left in his ownership, and that land had a connection to her mother that was as old as she was. And whatever Elias Croft had the right to do with his time there, he had the right to make sure that connection was honored before the bank took the rest of it. That was all it was. He told himself that. He stopped lying to himself about 2 miles before he got home and acknowledged quietly and with no particular drama that he had not written that letter because he was being hospitable. He had written it because the thought of her never being able to bring her mother's ashes to that river, because of a sequence of events and silences that had partly been his own fault, was something he could not sit with. He had been the one who did not ask the right question when he should have asked it. He had watched her look at the river the first morning she arrived, and filed the observation away instead of following it. He had seen the photographs and held them in his pocket for weeks without walking down the hall and knocking on the door. He had let his own guardedness cost both of them something. The letter was not just an invitation. It was a way of putting something real on the table without making her responsible for taking it. The night before January 15th, he went out to the cottonwood a final time. He had a small flashlight, but he did not use it. The moon was full, and the snow-covered ground threw back enough light to see clearly. He stood at the base of that tree and read the carving one more time. June plus Thomas, 1974. His father and June Bellamy. 2 young people at this bend in the river with a knife and an afternoon and the kind of certainty that belongs to people who do not yet know how long 50 years is. He put his hand on the bark, the way he had put his hand on the fence post at the start of all of this, touching something old that had held. Then he went back inside and waited for morning. She came on the morning of January 14th, not in the evening. Morning. He was down on his knees in the front yard replacing a section of water pipe that had burst overnight in the freeze. His hands were cold. He had the good gloves on, the ones June had left on his workbench without comment the week before she left, and even so the cold got through by the second hour. He heard the truck before he saw it. He recognized the sound of the engine. She parked beside the barn. She got out. She walked to the barn, and without ceremony or greeting she opened the side door and came back out carrying her toolbox, the one she had left behind. She walked to where he was kneeling beside the broken pipe section, and she opened the toolbox and took out a wrench and crouched down across from him. He looked at her. She looked at the pipe. She said, "That fitting is stripped. You need the smaller one." She handed him the right fitting from the tray of her toolbox. They worked in silence for 5 minutes. The morning was clear and brittle, the sky the color of old pewter, the cottonwood trees along the river standing black against it with all their leaves gone. Then, without looking at him, she said the part she had left out before. She had come to Larimer County the previous winter, she said, not just to find the tree and the river. She was a landscape architect. That was her work, had been for 20 years. Designing land use, figuring out what a piece of ground could sustain and how to build around that sustainably. When she had pulled the county records to understand the ownership situation, she had done something she could not help doing. She had looked at the land itself, at the water rights, the topography, the soil data, the access points. She had looked at it the way a doctor looks at a patient, which is to say she had looked at it with professional attention and had seen things that were not visible to someone standing in the middle of it. This land could work, she said. Not the way it had been working, which was not working at all, but with a different model. Limited seasonal rentals, rural retreat, managed rotation grazing, a small operation that used the river and the landscape as assets rather than trying to pretend this was big cattle country in 2023. It was not a revolutionary idea. It was a sustainable one. She had drawn up plans over the summer. Not because she had been asked, because she had seen the problem, and the problem had a solution, and leaving a solvable problem alone was not something she was capable of doing. She had not come here to save him, she said. She said that clearly. She had come here for her mother, but once she was here and working this ground and seeing what she could see from the inside, she had understood that it was possible for both things to happen. Her mother's ashes going to the right place, and the land not being lost. Elias listened to all of this while he worked on the pipe. He did not look at her. He worked on the fitting and listened, and let the words arrange themselves in the order they needed to be in. When she finished, he tightened the last connection. He stood up. He looked at her. She looked back at him. This time, neither of them looked away first. He said, "You still have the plans?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Can I see them?" "Can I see?" She said, "That's why I came." They went inside and she spread 3 hand-drawn sheets across the kitchen table. Not polished drawings, not presentation work. Working documents covered in measurements and notes in the margins. The kind of papers that came from someone thinking hard about a problem over a long period of time. She walked him through it. The grazing rotation was the first thing. A 4-season schedule that would let the damaged pasture on the east side recover over 2 years. The river access was the second thing. 2 small campsites on the north bank. Nothing elaborate, nothing that needed permits beyond what he already had for agricultural use, that could generate enough through 3 months of the year to cover the gap in what the cattle operation produced. The third thing was the woodlot, properly managed, yielding sustainable timber income on a 7-year rotation rather than the current approach of taking what was needed and not replacing it. Elias listened to each section. He asked questions. On the grazing rotation, he pushed back on the timing in the 3rd quarter because he knew from experience that this particular ground dried out in August faster than the standard model would predict. She noted the adjustment. On the campsites, he had a concern about the water table in the floodplain, and she had already accounted for it with a placement 40 yards east of where he assumed she meant. On the woodlot, she deferred to him entirely and said the replanting schedule was his to set. It was the first conversation they had ever had between 2 people who were simply equal. After 2 hours, he said, "This might work." She said, "It will work if you work it. It's not magic. It's just a plan." He nodded. Then he said, "Come on." They walked down to the river. She was carrying the small wooden box. He walked to the north end of the bank, the way he had said in the letter, and stopped there. She continued to the cottonwood. She stood at the base of it. He watched her open the box. She stood quietly for a moment. Then she tipped the box gently over the water and let the ashes go. The current was slow in January, and the pale gray dispersed into the clear, cold water, and moved off downstream with a kind of unhurried certainty that felt, to Elias standing at the north bank in the winter light, like exactly the right thing. He did not look away. He stayed where he was, not because it was his land, but because she should not have to do this alone. The quiet after lasted a long time. Then June reached up and put her hand on the bark of the cottonwood. She traced the carved letters without looking at them. She already knew what they said. She said quietly, "My mother's name was June Bellamy, before she married." He said, "My father's name was Thomas Croft." They stood with that. They did not rush to fill the silence. Some silences do not need filling. They need to be what they are for a minute, which is to say, exactly the weight they carry, no more and no less. After a while, they walked back to the house. That evening, sitting at the table with the plans spread between them, Elias asked her what she wanted in return for the work. She thought about it. A real pause. Not the automatic politeness of someone deflecting the question, but the actual consideration of someone who knows her own mind and wants to say it accurately. She said, "A piece of the riverland. Not much. Enough to plant what I want to plant. And I want to know I can come back here." He listened to that. He turned it over in his mind. He thought about the 7 years of carrying everything alone, and the months of carrying this specific weight alone, and the morning he had found the carving on the cottonwood and asked himself a question that had led him here, to this table, to this woman, to this evening. He said, "All right," she said, "all right." That was all it was. Love in this story was not a wave, it was not a thunderclap. It was a man who had been making coffee for 2 people for 2 months without registering it, sitting across from a woman who had drawn plans for his land over a summer and carried them here in the cab of her truck. Both of them saying all right to a future neither of them had designed alone. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Spring came to Larimer County the way it always did. Not dramatically, not in one warm morning that announced itself. It came in small adjustments. A degree warmer on Tuesday than Monday. Ice on the water troughs gone by 8 instead of 9. The color of the sky shifting from its deep winter pewter toward something softer and less resolved. And then one morning you looked out the window, and the ground had changed color. The dry brown gone to the first faint green at the edges of the low ground near the water. And you understood that the turn had happened while you were paying attention to other things. The debt restructuring took 6 weeks to process. June handled the documentation. It was her profession, or close enough to it, and she understood the language of financial institutions in a way that Elias, who had always conducted his business in plain terms and handshakes, did not. She prepared a 12-page business plan with projected revenue, land use maps, and a 5-year sustainability analysis. Warren Hollis reviewed it for 3 days. Dot McCready, who had known the county board members for 30 years and had extended credit to most of their families at some point, put in a quiet word in the right places. She did not announce this to Elias. She simply did it the way she did most things, which was without calling attention to herself. Warren called on a Thursday in February. He said the bank would approve a 24-month restructured payment schedule tied to the revenue projections in the plan. He said it in the flat tone of someone delivering information, not enthusiasm, but he said it. Elias said he appreciated it. Warren said it was business. After the call, Elias sat for a moment with his hand still on the phone. Then he went out to find June, who was in the east pasture checking the fence line that had been giving trouble since October. He walked out to where she was and he said, "The bank approved it." She was holding a pair of wire cutters. She looked at him. She said, "Good." Then she went back to the fence. He stood there for a second, not sure what he had been expecting, then went back to work himself. That was, he realized, exactly the right response. There was no celebration due, there was work due. They had bought themselves time, not salvation. The time still had to be used. In April, they planted the first tree line. It ran along the western boundary of the property, 40 young trees spaced for a windbreak and for shade along the edge of the grazing rotation. It was part of the plan. It was also, in some way that neither of them discussed, The beginning of something that would take 20 years to become what it was going to be. They planted in the morning when the ground was soft enough from the night's moisture. Elias set posts and June dug holes. They worked from the south end toward the north, moving steadily without conversation. It was comfortable work, the kind that does not require talking because the task itself provides enough structure. They had been working for about an hour when June drove the last stake of her section and stopped. She was looking at the line of young trees, each one barely knee-high, standing in the morning light with their stakes still beside them. She said, without turning to look at him, "I've been thinking I should move my things down from Denver, if that's all right with you." Elias drove the next post. He said without looking at her, "The back room needs painting. What color do you want?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Something that isn't gray." He said, "I'll get samples." They kept planting. That was how they did it. The reader could see the wholeness of it immediately, without anyone explaining it. No ceremony, no declaration, no moment that was meant to be witnessed. Just two people standing in a field of small trees on an April morning, saying the only words they needed to say, in exactly the right amount of words. Only these two people would do it this way. And it was completely right. The following morning, Elias went back to the northeast fence line. The same fence he had been working on the morning the story started, with the wrong nails and the bare hands and the bank notice in his pocket. He had new posts now and the right nails and the leather gloves that June had left on his workbench in December without commenting on them. He drove the last post. He looked at the letters carved into the old wood, at post 3, E.C. 2001. He had been 24 years old. He had believed land was the most reliable thing. He looked at those letters for a moment. He felt nothing like what he used to feel when he looked at them. Not loss, not regret, not the specific weight of a promise under threat. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had once been someone, and had gone through something, and had come out the other side still the same man, but not carrying the same fear. He picked up his toolbox and walked back toward the house. By summer, the grass along the river ran green and deep, the way it had not run in years. June had adjusted the irrigation timing in April, a small change that put the water where the root systems needed it, rather than where it had always been put by force of habit. The difference was visible from the kitchen window by June. Elias had looked out at that view most mornings for 25 years. He looked at it differently now. She had moved her things down from Denver in March. 3 truckloads over 2 weekends. Elias helped carry. She had more books than he expected and fewer clothes. The back room was painted a green that was not quite sage and not quite gray, but somewhere between the two. A color that turned out to be exactly right for that room at that light. The first rural retreat guests came in late May. 2 couples from Fort Collins who had found the listing online and wanted a weekend on a working ranch. June had handled the listing. Elias had handled the accommodations, which were spare and clean, and as June put it to the guests on their arrival, honest. They left on Sunday afternoon, having asked twice whether there was availability for October. There was availability for October. The work continued. The grazing rotation was showing results on the east pasture, the grass coming back in the patches that had been eaten down to dirt. The woodlot replanting was on schedule. The cattle were 14 head now, 3 calves having arrived in spring, which was the first time the number had gone up rather than down in 4 years. One morning in late July, June was sorting through the remaining boxes in the storage shed. She had been meaning to finish the clear-out since winter and kept finding other things to do first. This morning she had no excuse. Most of it was the expected accumulation of a working ranch over many decades. Old equipment manuals, seed catalogs from the 1980s, rodeo programs from county fairs going back to the 1970s. At the bottom of the last box, she found a wooden cigar box sealed with a rubber band that had dried and cracked. Inside were letters, a small journal, and 3 hand-drawn maps. The maps were of the valley, not Elias's land specifically. The whole valley, both sides of the county road, the river running through it. The maps were annotated in a handwriting she did not recognize. older and more formal than Thomas Croft's. The annotations used names she did not recognize for some features, and names she did recognize for others. She brought the box to Dot McCready that afternoon. Dot opened the journal and read for a few minutes. She turned the maps over and looked at the annotations. Then she set them down on the counter and was quiet for a moment. She said, "This belonged to Thomas Sr., Elias's grandfather." June said she thought so. Dot said, "You know the Bellamy land runs along the south boundary of this property." June said she knew that. She had found it in the county records in February. Dot said, "Do you know why your grandfather sold it?" June said she knew there had been financial difficulty. "A drought year." Dot said, 1962 was the worst drought in 20 years in this county. Frank Bellamy had 2 bad harvests in a row and a banknote due. He had no good options. She paused. Then she said, "Thomas Sr. bought that parcel to hold it. He and Frank Bellamy had come out here in the early 1950s together. Both families. They built this community side by side, shared equipment, shared labor, helped each other through the lean years. They were old friends. Thomas Sr. bought the land so the bank couldn't take it, and because he told Frank he'd sell it back when Frank got back on his feet." June was very still. Dot said, "Frank never got back on his feet. He moved the family east for work in 1963, and that was that. The land stayed Croft land. Thomas Sr. kept it, and then Thomas Jr. kept it, and now it's been Elias's." She looked at June. "Your mother grew up knowing about that land. Her father probably told her the story, and when she came back out here in 1974 and met Thomas Jr. at the river, she was standing on ground her family had once owned that another family had kept safe when nobody had to." June said nothing. Elias had come in from the field while Dot was talking. He was standing in the doorway of the store. He had heard the last part. He looked at June. She looked at him. Dot said, "The 2 families go back further than either of you knew. This was never just Croft land. It was always, in some sense, connected to your people, too." The 3 of them were quiet for a moment in that small store with the afternoon light coming through the windows at a low summer angle. Then Dot said, "It seems to me like the land has been waiting for somebody to figure that out." On the drive home, June and Elias said little. There was not much to say in the analytical sense. The facts were the facts. 2 families connected for 70 years across sails and silences, and 1 summer at a river bend. A piece of ground that had moved from hand to hand, but never entirely lost the thread of its own history. And 2 people who had arrived at the same place from different directions and found each other there. It was not destiny. Elias did not believe in destiny and never had. It was context. It was the fullness of a thing seen from far enough back to understand how many threads had been running toward this specific outcome for a very long time. That evening they walked down to the river together. It was the hour before dark, the summer light going long and golden across the water, the cottonwood throwing a shadow that reached all the way to the north bank. The cattle were in the far pasture. The campsites were empty on a weekday. The valley was quiet in the way it was quiet in the evenings, full of the sound of water and wind and nothing else. They stopped at the cottonwood. Elias reached out and took her hand. Not with deliberation, not as a gesture toward anything. It was simply what he did, the way he had been making coffee for 2 people all winter without deciding to. His hand found hers and stayed there. June looked at the carving. June plus Thomas, 1974. Her mother and his father, 2 young people who had stood at this bend 50 years ago and cut their names into the bark and had not been able to hold on to each other, who had gone their separate ways and built their separate lives and carried the memory of one summer for the rest of those lives. The river moved past them, slow and clear in the summer evening. June looked at the carving for a long time. Then she looked at Elias. He was already looking at her. He had found her name carved into a tree by the river, and he had searched. He had searched through county records and old photographs and conversations with old men on their porches. He had searched through his own silences and his own stubbornness, and the long winter of working alone, and the evening he had sat at the kitchen table and finally laid all the pieces out together. He had gone looking for a woman who was already gone. He had found her daughter instead. The cottonwood held its carving. The river held its course. The land held its memory, the way land holds everything, patient and without judgment, for as long as it takes for the right people to arrive and finally understand what they are standing on. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Some things do not need to be said. They only need to be understood. And standing there in the evening light with the river moving and the old tree beside them, and 50 years of someone else's love carved into the bark, they understood everything. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
There is a moment near the end of this story that stays with you long after the last word. Elias is standing at that old cottonwood, holding June's hand, looking at a carving his father made 50 years ago, and you realize something quietly remarkable. He spent months searching for the woman behind that name. He drove to town and pulled county records, and asked old men on their porches. He carried photographs in his shirt pocket like evidence, and the whole time, the answer was sitting across from him at the dinner table every single night. That is not just a plot twist. That is a truth about how we live. We search everywhere for the things that matter most, and we forget to look at what is already right in front of us. The first lesson this story carries is about silence in families. Thomas Croft loved June Bellamy deeply enough to carve her name into a tree and keep a single folded piece of paper for the rest of his life. But he never told his son. Not one word. And because of that silence, Elias spent years not knowing a whole chapter of his own father's heart. Secrets kept inside families do not protect anyone. They only leave spaces that the next generation has to fill in alone, without a map, without context, often too late. Talk to the people you love while you still can. Tell them the things that shaped you. The stories you carry quietly are the very ones your children need to hear. The second lesson is about the kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. Elias never asked for help. Not once. He carried $47,000 in debt, and a damaged reputation, and a dying ranch entirely alone, because he believed that asking for help would cost him the last thing he had left, which was his dignity. But what it actually cost him was time, and connection, and years of unnecessary wait. Strength is not always solitude. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let someone else stand beside them. The third lesson belongs to June. She came to this land not to rescue a stranger, but to honor her mother. She came because love does not end when a person dies. It changes shape. It becomes an obligation, a quiet persistence. A daughter driving across a state to scatter ashes at a river bend because a dying woman asked her to. That is what devotion looks like in real life. Not grand gestures, just showing up and doing the thing that needs doing even when it is hard, even when no one is watching. And the last lesson is the one the land itself teaches. The ground remembers. Two families built something together a long time ago, and then lost each other to hard seasons and hard years. But the connection never fully broke. It waited, the way good land waits, patient and without judgment, until the right people arrived, and finally understood what they were standing on. Nothing that was truly built with love ever disappears completely. It just waits for someone to find it again.